fifth-year architect. I'm also a Hop Studio veteran who was here last quarter. I'm sort of running with the project that I did last time, which was, like Joe, kind of concentrating on this area between Spring Grove and the Mill Creek. I'm also working within the framework of a transit-oriented development. My plan is slightly different than Joe's, but my main concern is actually zoomed in a little bit more on a building scale. Myself being an architect, I started to design some buildings. Usually when you try to get a well-rounded transit-oriented development, it's important to include housing, and if it's affordable housing, even better, and that's sort of what I've been trying to work with, actually sort of a mixed income housing development that would be sort of along the bank of the Mill Creek. And let's see, I don't want to do too much comparing and contrasting here, but I also was sort of trying to keep the surface parking to a minimum. We talked a little bit about the surface parking in front of Kroger, and I definitely wasn't as respectful to their parking lot. I decided that I would like to kind of reorient the parking and move it over here. So this is a fairly large parking structure now that can serve the Kroger, but also the transit hub here, which I have on this side of Mitchell. And this transit hub, I believe, can serve people going to the Kroger and also serve these new development that I'm trying to bring in. So you can see in my section, essentially what you'll have is your transit hub, and then this kind of commercial and office zone, and then you kind of move into a residential zone. And that's kind of one of the reasons that I was looking at both scales, because when you're dealing with housing, there's a lot of issues that are dealing with, the relationships to the city, the relationships to transportation, that sort of thing. And I wanted to look at a larger scale a little bit. One of the things that I'm looking at here is creating a more private-like residential zone, as in it's kind of off of this axis, which would be kind of the more busy street where you'd have people coming in and out, and a lot of your retail, and the Kroger, of course, are on this area. But this would be a much more quiet zone. We've got one-way streets, and it's not through streets, so this is a lot more quiet and hopefully a little bit more residential feeling area. Also, another thing that I was looking at, and this is something that I spent a little bit more time dealing with last quarter, but just trying to keep the development off of the Mill Creek and allowing the sort of restoration to come through, and the sort of recreation along the Mill Creek, which is kind of a lot of people are looking at that. There's a lot of plans to put bike trails and that sort of thing. Essentially, as an urban design project, the best thing I think you can do is just sort of try to keep the development off of the Mill Creek to allow that to happen. And of course, I'm also dealing with this fantasy world where we can just get rid of those car dealerships. But yeah, let's just pretend that they're gone. So I would like to talk a little bit more about my housing, because this is kind of what I was spending a little bit more time looking at. The concept here is trying to create a little bit more dense sort of housing arrangement, but to give all the amenities that you would expect. So all these people are going to have private backyards with clearly delineated spaces for themselves, and a residential pedestrian-friendly kind of walking setting. And then also I've allotted this sort of this spot right here that would be kind of felt like it was owned by the residents and not necessarily the commercial space. This could be kind of a little bit more recreational spot that the residents feel like they own. So that's one of the spaces that I was working to create. The other spaces that I'm dealing with are obviously in between the buildings. One of the this diagram here sort of gets to that idea of public versus private space, and in housing design, that's something that's pretty important. There's a guy named Oscar Newman that's done a lot of research into the idea of creating private spaces that people feel like they own, and thus they take more care of it, and they take more stock into surveilling spaces, and it's generally a good idea to not have ambiguously owned spaces that no one's taking care of. So this is something I'm looking at. One of the moves that I made is trying to put parking in the middle of this street area. Like I said, I've got these one-way streets, and the parking is in the middle. That's a strategy that people use a lot to try to get people to take note of the street. By having your car on the street, it brings your attention to it. It has you coming and going in between these spaces, as opposed to putting parking behind your house where it's not really, it's an afterthought, and there's kind of, you don't have any reason to really be going in between these spaces and communicating with other people and that sort of thing. So that's one of the ideas that I had. I will talk a little bit about the arrangement of these buildings at this scale. But I'll go back actually to a larger scale. These kind of funky diagrams that I have right here are kind of a response to the highway. And we were talking about the views from the highway and that sort of thing. And obviously this area right here is an important area when we start to talk about views of the highway. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to think of how can I create some sort of relationship with the highway. This diagram here, I just sort of took the radius of the highway and just sort of extended it onto the site. And I realized that, it's kind of an arbitrary formal move, but it actually allowed me to do some really great things for the housing here that I think are worthwhile. For instance, just by kind of extending these lines in, what I ended up doing is taking these units and starting to orient, maybe every other one or so to these lines. And what that does is it breaks up the monotony of the block, and that's something that's pretty important to do with housing, because especially with affordable housing, there's sort of like a stigma associated with like long barrack-like houses. So taking these formal cues, I'm able to sort of create a little bit of visual interest. And more importantly, what I'm able to do is to create these kind of interstitial spaces between the buildings that become a sort of hybrid between the public and the private space that I think could be a pretty nice area for a few people to interact. So looking at this rendering here, this is sort of my finalized design ideal, where this street here is sort of a public zone, and then once you kind of slip into this spot in between, you might have maybe about 4 different units sharing this area. Put some benches in there and maybe a little landscaping, and that might be a place where people could be comfortable to sort of interact with one another, but it's not on the street necessarily, and it's not a purely private zone. So that's the kind of space that I'm interested in creating. This diagram right here gets at my design kind of methodology here. I've sort of been talking about this, but I'll just lay it out for you. I think that a lot of the times when you see kind of an affordable housing, I don't know if you guys have seen City West, or Hope 6 project like that. You get a pretty cut and paste sort of design. I feel like it's kind of what you'll have is you'll have these row houses. You'll push one back and push one forward, and then you put these gabled roofs on it, and then you get a little bit of variety at the end, but it's really kind of it's all pretty much the same to me. And I was really trying to hope that I could get some of the same ideas of creating a little bit of visual variety and creating a homey feel, but using a little bit of a different methodology. So what this diagram shows is taking the kind of formal blocks, but instead of pushing them out, I'm pulling them apart and creating the space in between, and then I'm starting to sort of play with the masses here, and creating, pushing forward and back to create these front and back porches that are your outdoor spaces. And I think that I've been able to create the same kind of spaces that you would expect in a residential project, only in a slightly different way. So that's something that I was trying to get to. Here is just a exploded axon showing how how one of these units would be organized. I would have a 3 to 4 bedroom unit on the top 2 floors, so these would be sharing an entrance right here. And then on the ground floor you have a 1 bedroom that would be ADA accessible. You could come in here up a little ramp and into your unit. So that's another idea, is creating a variety of spaces where you have 1 bedroom, 4 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, all of these different kind of family structures can live together in a similar area. I talked a lot, so if you guys have any questions.